Syrian film El Compars, or The Extra, starts in a small room in which Salim anxiously paces around. Salim's friend had generously lent him the space for 2 hours to meet his lover Nada. And when she arrives, they first sit close, not yet touching, and the air around them is very thick with a fear that has no single source. They have 2 hours to exist together without being watched, but they will spend these next 2 hours constantly intercepting every moment of tenderness with paranoia of being caught and constant suspicion of their neighbors spying on them.
ما بتحييه يلا قولي شو
خلص يلا. كيف يا سافل؟
تخني صوتي كيف يا سافل حاكم
كيف يا سافل؟
بتشوف
بتشوف نائبي
وما بتحييه
وما تحييه.
عيديها يلا
كيف يا سافل؟ بتشوف نائبي وما بتحييه.
يا سيدنا الحاكم انت بتصدق الحكي.
In the small space, they will rehearse a marriage without witnesses, play theater for an audience of one, imagine lives they cannot live outside this room. In another story, these could all be preludes for a romance, but in this story, they are acts of survival. This is why Il Compars feels Kafkaesque. The machinery of oppression has no single face. Only procedures, roles, and a constant awareness that you are already guilty of something that you can't even name. This gaze, a discipline that works not by punishing you directly, but making you internalize the possibility of a looming punishment at any moment. Without giving the story away, the film's final moments are marked by a surprising and senseless act of violence. A policeman turns while in the middle of arresting Salim's neighbor and slaps Salim for merely happening to be in his vicinity. And when the slap comes, it's almost too casual, the kind of violence that isn't meant to destroy you but to remind you who you are. Salim is of course shaken and emasculated in front of Nada and is diminished in that moment. The film takes you through 2 hours where Salim learns how to be fluent, his usual stutter slowly disappears over the course of the film, only for it all to be unmade in these last moments. And the film's director Nabil Maleh knew this intimately. He grew up as a student in Prague. His own life pivoted when he played an extra in a Czech film, a moment that pulled him from physics to cinema. And long before making Il Compars as a child in Damascus, a soldier's slap also planted in him a lifelong hunger for dignity. Repression is not just about silencing, it's about shaping. It determines what can be said, how it can be said, what can be thought. And in Il Compars, repression is the very texture of this world that these characters inhabit. The nervous laughter, the constant glances over the shoulder and looking out of your window. This is why the film's love scene isn't even love as cinema usually stages it. It's love rehearsed under the conditions of this surveillance and repression. It's a love that is haunted by this risk of interruption at any moment. In the end, Salim and Nada leave in opposite direction with the warmth and the comfort and trust that they spent 2 hours building being torn apart in that casual moment of violence. In what could be considered the golden decades of Arab cinema, which would be the mid 20th century through the 1970s, Egypt was the beating heart, Lebanon could be considered the experimenter, and Palestinian cinema was militant. Syria was, however, something stranger and much more difficult to define. The country, of course, didn't have the Cairo-sized industry, nor the wealth to bankroll production. And yet, in its most fertile moments, Syrian cinema produced works that are cathartically beautiful. Unlike the churn of Egypt's studios, Syrian films were sparse, often years apart, and they were usually dense with metaphor, and definitely political. Not in the way of manifestos or militancy that you see in Palestinian cinema, but in the way of poetry. It was indirect, it was very allusion heavy, requiring the audience to lean in. From the start, the state had its hands on the Syrian camera. The National Film Organization, created ostensibly to develop cinema, became the gatekeeper of what could be and couldn't be made, allowing just enough works to prove that the country had its own cinema.
في شيء اسمه أفلام سورية، ما في سينما سورية. يعني السينما الصناعة، ما في صناعة مستمرة. يعني إذا حكينا عن السينما السورية، في كل تاريخ السينما السورية في 140 فيلم. من بين ال أو 150 فيلم، المؤسسة مشتغلة شيء أقل من 40 فيلم. من بين ال 40 فيلم في 7 أفلام أو 10 أفلام هي أفلام جيدة فوق المستوى، والباقي عادي أو تعيس.
طيب بشو بتمتاز
فيها موزايك إنساني ومحلي ووطني وكوميدي وتاريخي وفيها حرية رأي وكلام حلو وفيها فن، يعني فيها فن.
يا جميل.
So, in documentary as silent cinema, it captures this paradox. For example, director Osama Muhammad's Stars of the Day wasn't officially banned, it was just never allowed to be distributed. And this is a very distinctly Syrian form of censorship, this oral ban. The law says nothing, but the film will, of course, disappear if not allowed to be distributed. In a way, it's more suffocating than a written prohibition, because when a film is openly banned, the act itself is visible and can be resisted. But an oral ban is hard to fight or contest. There were, of course, moments when history itself forced the Syrian camera to flinch, like in the Six-Day War, which left a deep scar on Syrian society. In Muhammad Malas's Konaitra, ruins of the recaptured town are filmed, but not as a site of heroism, but as a hollowed-out shell, a place where the absence is louder than the presence. Wars, coups, and the long presidency of Hafiz al-Assad meant that filmmakers operated in a state where history is omnipresent but also untouchable. You could gesture to it, you could mourn it, but you could not name it too clearly, otherwise you're co-signing your own erasure and the end of your career. And yet, some directors found ways to smuggle truths past these obstacles. In A Plate of Sardines by Omar Amiraleh, he meditates on his first memory of entering Beirut, a meditation of war, exile, and hunger. On the surface, it is about a meal. It is, of course, about everything else. And in Waha al-Rahib's dreamy visions, she cloaks social critique in surrealism and allegory. In Syrian film The Ceiling, it stages its drama in a domestic space that becomes a metaphor for the suffocating public sphere. This is the beautiful and sad Syrian cinema trick. If you can't show the wound directly, you can show the way it makes people walk. Consider Omar Amiraleh's everyday life in a Syrian village. At first glance, it seems to fulfill the National Film Organization's appetite for rural documentation, because on the surface it's a film about agriculture, community, the supposed progress brought by the Ba'athist state. But beneath the tracking shots of the village life, Amiraleh also builds a quiet counter-narrative. And this narrative says that the land is tired, the people are weary, and the progress is so far a slogan that isn't reflected in the soil. This is the compliant/subversive double bind. A film must appear to serve the state's narrative, but also plant seeds that grow in the audience's private mind.
الخامس من تموز دخل نهر الفرات إلى المدرسة الجديدة ليتعلم كيف يقرأ وكيف يكتب وكيف يمارس الحب مع الحقول والأشجار بطريقة عصرية.
Amiraleh's later work, A Flood in Bath Country, sheds even this pretense of compliance. Here, the flood is not only the literal collapse of a dam, but also the suffocating inundation of propaganda, the overwhelm of waves of the party's self-mythology. Abdul Latif Abdelhamid's The Night of the Jackal leans toward fable. It's a portrait of a rural community at a moment of moral fracture, where alliances are shifting, gossip and violence are festering. The jackal is also literal and metaphorical, the predator outside outside and the predator within. And it's a reminder that in Syria, danger is not only the state, but also the way the state has conditioned Syrians to look at their own neighbors. And so Syrian cinema has lived in this tension. It had to keep this balance intact, even as it longed to shatter it. Muhammad Malas's The Dream, which is one of my favorite documentaries, is set in a Palestinian refugee camp. But the spiritual undercurrent of it is very unmistakable. The interviewees' dreams are narrated like prophecy, and they all well from a collective subconscious of devotion, pain, and unyielding love. Al-Lajat takes us to a barren landscape that feels monastic. Characters move through it like ascetics, stripped of everything, and in this beautiful work, the land itself is the altar. It's silent and waiting for our offering. The absence of explicit religious dialogue here is not the absence of spirituality. It's very reminiscent of Tarkovsky, not just the message, but also the very fate of this film. In the film Black Flower, it turns the most basic act, making bread, into ritual. This flour that is blackened by scarcity becomes a communion wafer of survival and distorts the following act of eating from one of pleasure and fulfillment into one of endurance and sanctified by necessity. So Syrian cinema, as we've seen, was often irresolute and interrupted by the censor's pen. And it was suffocated by bureaucracy, by exile, and by fear. But also precisely because of this incompletion, these films are, as I said, some of the most beautifully cathartic films you'll ever see. They have existed in this unbearable tension between what is shown and what is withheld. Think of Nabil Maleh, Omar Amiraleh, and Muhammad Malas. These are amazing men whose careers can literally be, unfortunately, counted in films lost or restricted rather than films made. The lives of Syrian filmmakers were punctuated by these very long silences. Of course, they're enforced, not creative silences, that are meant to kill your spirit as a creative. In a silent cinema, director Mayar El-Rumi, he shows us directors who could count their life's work only on one hand, because the machinery of the state had decided that one film every decade was more than enough to keep them from rebelling and to tame them. This makes the few films that managed to reach us incredibly important as records of what life was like under layers of repression, bureaucratic absurdities, private yearnings, and the subliminal messaging that these films carried. They show us the ways people learned to live inside these limits and the ways they dreamed beyond them. In full disclosure, I wrote the script before the beginning of this year, and as you know, Syria today is also in another state of transition. And I'm sure this transition will also leave a trace in the future of Syria's cinema history. I'm not sure what Syrian cinema will carry in the next decades. Maybe it will not be the same as the cinema of Nabil Maleh or Omar Amiraleh. It may be shaped by exile or by digital immediacy or by a strange nostalgia of those who know Syria only through memories or inherited stories. This script was very difficult to wrap up. There was so much to cover, and it was also important for me to think about Syrian cinema history also in light of these new recent events. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Goodbye.